The cooperative mindset, sharing the load, sharing the responsibility, and sharing in the benefits, ultimately took several generations to become natural and comfortable. The farther Belgium distanced itself from the old money system, the easier these new mindsets became. Many problems were a direct result of people still viewing certain aspects of the new system in the same ways they had viewed them in the old system. But as the paradigm shifted, people were slowly able to free themselves from these old pedantic beliefs. After several decades, a generation came along that was raised in the cooperativist environment and for whom cooperativism was perfectly natural. We quote from Sri Lakwadamam, a noted historian from the 23rd century, and his historical perspective on this process. Quote, "As the transition was accomplished and a working cooperatism stabilized, political parties became unnecessary. There was no longer any need for formal national leaders. Under a fully functioning cooperativist system, people didn't need to be led by any individual or group of individuals. The people themselves were able to take the reins. That, however, is not to say that there weren't various individuals who stood out or even became icons in society due to particular talents, skills, inventions, or discoveries, and who therefore enjoyed a degree of national and even international fame. And these individuals very often became role models to a greater or lesser degree, and generally would assume some sort of leadership persona. They could be very influential with regards to projects, policies, and improvements, but they were not voted for to assume some office that gave them the power to make policy. They remained just ordinary citizens in terms of power and rights, just like everyone else. But people were often guided by the wisdom of these prominent individuals. The cooperative system provided its own innate stability. The system itself took care of most needs, so there weren't a great deal of pressing issues that needed constant attending to. Many of these popular personalities did internet broadcasts commenting on the state of affairs throughout the country, and these commentaries were widely viewed. They would make observations and discuss various ideas and proposals that they felt should be considered. They would make suggestions as to how certain issues might be resolved and hold open forums for public input. They became the new media voice and often the new informal, unofficial leaders, and yet were still just ordinary citizens, putting in their time, rotating through the workforce just like everyone else, getting no special perks or privileges. They were part of the people. They developed reputations for fairness and common sense, and for exploring the many different facets of an issue. There was still a great deal of leadership under cooperativism. It just was a different kind of leadership. A leader's popularity depended on having an affinity with the people, a way of thinking that shared the common concerns and sentiments of the citizenry, and a knack for suggesting amiable solutions that benefited the nation as a whole without compromising individual freedom. There was no political mudslinging or political rhetoric to secure votes. There were no campaign promises or campaign contributions. In fact, there were no campaigns at all. There were no powerful, politically connected corporations, no corporate-controlled lobbyists, no bureaucracies, and no graft. It was no longer about the money and the power." End quote. We now give the reader some personal accounts of how this self-governance played out in these early times. One of these new leaders writes this, quote, "An individual's freedom can never be compromised by legislation, with the exception of those obvious matters regarding criminality or the hindering of another's personal freedom by direct interference. Freedom is fervently safeguarded within the limits of common sense and practicality, and the people now have the power to assure this is always upheld, without being eroded through politics and/or bureaucracy. There are no monopolies or the monopolization of any technique, procedure, or device. everything is always within public domain. However, great lengths are taken to ensure proper credit is given to those who discover, invent, or first produce various innovations. Information, knowledge, and means are free to everyone at all times. Taxation is no longer necessary. Private ownership of land has been replaced with exclusive rights of occupancy to safeguard the private use of one's residence. This gives our country a uniqueness among modern industrial societies with regard to quality of daily life." End quote. We now include an excerpt from a historical account of the times, written by Arnaud Lemons. In the old system, he held the position of being a prominent and influential judge, and also served as a member of Parliament for several terms. In the new system, he went on to be a respected and sought-after arbiter in civil disputes, a designation he willingly and enthusiastically accepted. He volunteered his time to do this, and was a good example of how retirees so often continued throughout the rest of their lives to fill useful and needed roles in society, some volunteering back into the workforce, others, like Arnaud, who found a niche that benefited society in some other way. He writes, quote, "The legal system became simplified under cooperatism. Certain universal laws are in place to formally state things which should be obvious, such as laws against inflicting bodily harm to another, or stealing, or for protecting the environment and the rights of freedoms of individuals. Laws generally are not there to force compliance with some actions that must be performed, such as paying taxes in the old system or compelling participation in the workforce in the new system, but rather to prevent some maltreatment of an individual or group by another. Lawsuits have become a thing of the past. People take it upon themselves to look out for their own as well as each other's safety. People generally see this as common sense, not something that should or needs to be legislated and mandated, and those that decide to take chances do so at their own risk. In cooperatism, safety is voluntary. Individuals are free to refuse participation in any workforce activity or enter into any circumstances where they feel they have safety concerns. When this occurs in the workforce, the workers themselves figure out a way to adequately address the safety issue or figure out an alternative way of accomplishing what is needed so that the progress can continue. Safety under cooperatism is considered a choice. It is each individual's personal responsibility. It is not compulsory. It is not a requirement. If a tragedy befalls an individual, that individual is already a part of a society that is meeting their needs on a daily basis and will continue. Cooperatism is about living your life to the fullest, independently, while being guaranteed a certain standard of living below which you cannot fall, regardless of your circumstances. People are freer. Laws are fewer. People take more responsibility. Common sense has become the unwritten law. Laws are enacted sparingly and only in cases where fundamental principles need to be safeguarded. Common people resolve differences, not professional lawyers and judges within a legal bureaucracy. Justice is more about being an inquiry into the truth and is founded on common sense. It is no longer based on legal jargon and technicalities. It is about arriving at a truthful, fair verdict, not about winning a case. End quote. We now include an excerpt from Manon de Backer's book, Government by Citizens. She writes, quote, "Voting was taken very seriously in this new society. The voting process was modeled after the one in use in Alpha City, and like Alpha City's voting structure, the highest priority was given to the results being totally verifiable by the voters themselves. This was the goal and considered a crucial element, and made it extremely difficult for any kind of ballot tampering to take place. Any such attempts became obvious and were dealt with very seriously. A key element to achieve open, publicly verifiable results was the requirement for each individual to take public responsibility for and ownership of their vote. Voting was not anonymous. Initially, there was concern that people would not feel free to always vote as they were inclined to, due to peer pressure being applied to vote a particular way and a fear of possible repercussions for failing to do so. However, it wasn't like in the old system where people were fervently attached to their agendas because it may greatly affect their incomes or ideological, religious, or philosophical beliefs, forcing compliance to these new policies. There was no forced compliance in cooperatism. Personal freedom was safeguarded. There was no reason for people to be so pedantic and or fanatical. People were free to either participate or not, regardless of the outcome of the vote. A great many of the issues had to do with questions such as, is it time for the workforce to replace a 20-year-old bridge? Or is it advantageous at this time for the workforce to start producing a particular item for international distribution? If there were those who severely objected to a proposal, then they were free not to participate in that endeavor. Those that supported it were free to participate. So there was really no incentive, as in the old system, for people to attempt to coerce anyone else to vote a particular way. A vote of affirmation meant that you would be willing to participate in that proposal. A vote against meant that you may not be willing to participate in that proposal. Voting was a way to reveal accurately where the majority of the country stood and therefore whether people would voluntarily comply or not. If a majority voted to voluntarily comply, then the proposal would be implemented and there would be no need for legislation. As it turns out, it was mostly the case that those in the minority also consented to willfully comply and give way to the majority decision. This was considered fair and advantageous for the country as a whole, and the population generally acted on this unwritten rule." End quote. A Polish national writes this, quote, "Cooperatism isn't trying to help the poor or destroy the rich. It's just trying to stop the acquisition and influence of power with regard to small groups or individuals that are able to gain and wield that power to control and dictate to others. It says power should stay within the control of the individual regarding that individual's life. This is possible when people are not forced to conform in order to obtain basic needs." End quote. A Spanish writer comments, quote, "The difference between cooperatism and other systems is cooperatism doesn't say you can't or you must. Everything is governed by agreement." End quote. We now quote from the memoirs of the wife of a former wealthy large estate owner in Belgium during this transitional period. Quote, "As you know, at first we were utterly opposed to this system of cooperatism. However, though we no longer have the power of our wealth, we have found this advantage to be unnecessary to our continued happiness and enjoyment of life. In fact, our lives are more carefree in a way that would be difficult for us to envision under the former system. The constant details that needed attending to, the endless decisions that needed to be made, the perpetual scrutiny that was needed to safeguard our possessions, estate, and lifestyle disappeared. We are far freer and happier than we would have thought possible. Certain advantages of our old life are missed. However, the utter abandon and worry-free state in which we now live, and I would never have imagined myself saying this, is preferable in many ways. We have a retired status and therefore no workforce responsibilities. We are free to travel wherever we choose. We are free to live wherever we choose, including our beloved estate. The estate is being kept up and cared for in a way which has more than met with our approval. The Society for Estate Preservation organizes walkthrough tours for the general public, allowing the populace to share in its beauty and culture. The grounds are open for public enjoyment and endowed with well-kept gardens and floral displays, either maintained by occupants or floral clubs that delight in these endeavors. The Society sees to it that the estate is populated with caring, capable, and responsible occupants, who will not let its legacy fade away. And if we, the original owners, feel nostalgic, we can return and be welcomed and regaled as the former owners, proudly shown the current state of things, and be given automatic occupancy rights to live there again as honored residents. We are revered in a way that is quite flattering and are consulted on new plans, although we do not have the final decision as we used to. Still, our opinions are always strongly considered, and we have a confident trust in the Society's proposals and decisions. They always seem to have the best interests of the estate in mind. We have forged strong new friendships with many what I would consider partners in the maintenance and preservation of our heritage." End quote.